Welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
Welcome to our show. We're going to talk about a topic, and it's going to be somewhat spontaneous. And today we're talking about, we just got a bit of the giggles. Today we're talking about a very specific thing. I think the 80s was one of the best decades for comedy because I think that in the 80s you had the greatest variety of comedies. And originally we were going to do just a show based on 80s comedies, right, Randall?
That's right.
But the problem was it became too damn big. So instead of just covering 80s comedy all at once, we've decided to just do it subgenre by subgenre. And one of the ones that is probably the most nearest and dearest to me, and probably the ones everybody here is familiar with, is the 80s teen comedy. It's nearest and dearest to us both because when the decade began, I was 14 going on 15. And when the decade ended, I was 24 going on 25. Randall, how old were you at the beginning of the 80s?
Well, I was born in 1975, so I was 5 years old.
And by the end of the decade, you yourself was a teenager. You were 15. So there is a really lovely parallelism between this particular genre of films and what was going on in our own lives. Also, there'd always been in cinema, there'd always been films about teens, but it was never like a lot of them. Often they were like about rock and roll, or they were about melodramas, about doing drugs or something. They weren't a genre unto themselves. They were, at best, you'd see them often in horror movies, but it wasn't a very serious genre. You could have they're like, by the end of the 70s, you definitely had films about youth, but they were all one-offs, whether it was like The Bad News Bears, it was really about preteens, or Breaking Away, which is a great film, but it's certainly more about teens who had just got out of high school. Meatballs is a pretty good precursor film. It was about campers. You had mentioned Rock and Roll High School.
Yeah, that's right. Rock and Roll High School. It was a silly B movie that was made for a low budget, but I feel is very influential on the films of this period.
So again, you're having so just before you get into the decade, you really have some really interesting films, some edgy films, some dark films. But there's no consistency. It's not yet a genre. Whereas once the decade is over, it will be a genre unto itself.
May I add something, Chris?
Go for it, yeah.
So I think one thing that's unique about this era is you have a lot of you have the rise of shopping malls. Shopping malls are very popular, and so you had a lot of teens going to the mall and hanging out with their friends and seeing movies by themselves.
There are a lot of stuff like that. Malls.
And so I think a lot of these movies are made to capture that audience.
Before we get into to start this discussion, I just want to let you guys know the movies that we picked aren't every movie from the 80s. They're not even every teen movie from the 80s. We picked movies that we both thought were really good, films that we saw. Sometimes we didn't even see these films in the 1980s, but later in life. Certainly, in almost all of these films, there are going to be things that are no longer funny about them. But the belief is that we all thought these are films that are good. They left an impact with us. And when you look at these movies in a whole, you can kind of see an arc or a progression of the decade. And I think, in a sense, because of the 10-year difference between the two of us, I think we're both looking at it from the same perspective, which is, are these films about what it's like to be a teen? Are these films about what you wish life was like as a teen? For me, I'm a teenager as this is beginning, and you're going to become a teen as this picks up. So I think the very first film I ever saw that was a quote-unquote teen movie of this genre was in 1980, and that was a film called My Bodyguard, which starred Chris Makepeace. It took place in Chicago. He was this rich high school kid who gets bullied by Matt Dillon, who plays the bully. And he hires this other kid, this thuggy kid, played by Adam Baldwin. If you're fans of Firefly, you might recognize the actor. It's a very sweet film. Ruth Gordon is in it, Ed Begley Jr. it is I was roughly around the same age as that kid, and I had been picked on when I was younger, so I could very much relate to what it was like to live in a city. I could relate what it was like to have bullies. Uh, I never hired anyone to protect me, so maybe that's more of the wish fulfillment. Uh, it's a very good film. All the actors in it do a great job. Chris Makepeace was a really talented teen actor. He did a number of great films in the late 70s and early 80s. I have no idea whatever happened to him. But there isn't much romance. There isn't many adults in it. It is really about what it's like to just live in high school and have to deal with popularity and threats and violence. And the two kids, the bully and played by Adam Baldwin, and the rich kid played by Chris Makepeace, there's a real interesting class difference between the two of them and their understanding of it. It's a very a lot of things that are going to pop up throughout the decade you can really find in that film. Have you ever seen the movie, Randall?
No, I haven't seen it, but it's interesting you talk about the class difference. There's a lot of class difference in these films, a lot of analysis of class difference.
And they're going to definitely be something that we're going to be paying a lot of attention to, as well as, for some weird reason, Chicago pops up a lot. A movie that also came out in the early 80s that you are a big fan of was Zapped. Well, 1982. Tell me about that.
Well, I was a kid when it came out. I didn't really see when it came out, but it came out on TV eventually. And, it was kind of infamous at the time because it's one of the dumbest sex comedies ever made. And
the
TV version.
What's the premise of the movie?
I'll get to it. So the premise of the movie, the reason it's so dumb, it's just about a guy that I think it's a high school kid. He develops telekinetic powers to remove women's clothing, so he can. I think, if I remember it right,
it stars Scott Baio.
Yeah, Scott Baio, famously right-wing Scott Baio. He's a star of the movie, and yeah, it's just
Chachi from Happy Days.
Yes, and it's just a dumb sex. Oh, yeah, it's almost like ironic that he made this movie because he was a child star on the show Happy Days, which, Happy Days, Grease, those kind of projects were forerunners to these kind of movies. But so in Happy Days, he's a sex symbol, both on screen and off screen. And when he makes this movie Zapped, he plays like a total nerd that can't get the girls, right? And the nerd construct, we're going to get to that, right? The nerd construct.
Absolutely. And as well as high concept science fiction.
Yes, the nerd construct and high concept science fiction, the very important part of a lot of these movies. But in Zapped, Scott Baio's a total nerd, can't get the girls, but he develops telekinetic powers, I think it is, to rip off women's clothing. The movie came out, if I remember right, it was an R-rated movie. I mean, it's basically a movie for adults. I mean, people aren't going to understand this today, but pornography was hard to come by back then. So a lot of people would go to the movies there would be nudity in movies. I mean, now almost every
movies. Yeah.
Almost every movie back then would have like the nude scene, right? Quote unquote, right? Like
there was nudity in comedy back then, because comedy, you hit on something, which is if they made movies for teens, and my Bodyguard is a much softer comedy, but I mean, the movie that really defines the sex comedy for teens in that year would have been Zapped is 1982, but Zapped is even, I think, released to cash in on the success of Porky's, which comes out in 1981 and is a teen raunch sex comedy with, I would argue, its feet firmly in the 70s. It's definitely Meatball. Right. I didn't see it when it came out because I love the movie Meatballs, which also starred Chris Makepeace as the sensitive kid that Bill Murray befriends. And it's a great film, and it almost would have made this movie, but it's more rooted in the 70s. But Porky's too. Porky's is also about sex, comedy, titillation.
I think both those movies.
I have no memory of the movie. I think I must have seen it eventually after everybody I know. So is it? Yeah, I if you were expecting we were going to spend a large amount of time talking about summer camp teen comedies from the 80s, a very notable part of the subgenre, we're just going to let you down. We're just going to let you down because it's a pretty crappy movie in my opinion, and it's a movie that doesn't hold up.
Well, I wish I'd done more research into this, but I feel like movies like Porky's and Zapped, even Rock and Roll High School, I feel like those are movies made for adults. I mean, Porky's and Zapped are both rated R. They have nudity. They're raunchy. I don't think they're made for teens, but maybe teens flock to those movies to see them, and then Hollywood got the idea, and that's how.
Well, I mean, as a
this whole genre really took off.
You don't have, if you want to ask a teen from the 80s, I'll tell you.
Yeah, did you see them in the theater or what?
Well, these movies, yeah. I grew up in New York City, so everyone's different, but access to R-rated films were very easy in my time. And like a movie that's not on this list, but I think it really kind of codifies it, is the most popular teen movie of the early 1980s that wasn't Porky's, that's can't really be on here because it's not a comedy, it's not a happy drama, was Fame, which came out in 1980. Very big movie. Everybody I knew, we all went to see. It's also the only movie on this list that takes place in New York City. But it deals with suicide, pornography, homosexuality. There's a lot of big, juicy topics in Fame, handled really well. It's a really great film.
Well, let me ask you,
it does not belong on this list, but my point is, it set up a level of maturity in dealing with these issues that in the next set of films, I think are better examples. Meaning, I think the next bunch of films were greenlit because Porky's was so damn successful, but I felt like they had the intelligence of movies like Fame. They had, I feel, the sensitivity of a movie like My Bodyguard, which is, and I saw every one of these films in the theater when they came out, except for one, which I watched like 2 years later on VHS. So
I just want to chime in with my experience too about R-rated movies. Yeah, I remember that too. I mean, I think it got different later on down the line. The PG-13 rating came out and all that in
what year is PG-13?
I think it came out with Temple of Doom, I think in 82 or 83.
So right around
maybe 84. But
I think that's 84.
But let me just say, like, the whole enforcing the R-rated movies, not letting teenagers in R-rated movies, like, I don't think a lot of movie theaters gave a crap about that.
But it really depended. In 1981, I was working in a summer camp in Hinsdale, Massachusetts. I wanted to see Arthur, and I couldn't get in because I was under 17, and they had a strict policy.
But if you were an adult,
a month later, when I was back in Manhattan, I went back and saw that movie with my friends who were campers, and there was no problem. So certainly, I would argue the R-rated film as a restriction, it just really depended where you lived.
Okay.
And because I lived in a city where I could pick up cigarettes and beer, it may have impacted why a 15-year-old saw so many R-rated movies.
Yeah, you know what? I remember buying cigarettes in high school too. Like, it was not hard to do. I mean, most people didn't enforce it. But anyway, I wanted to ask you a question.
And then also, I just want to say, maybe a part of the reason why some of these movies I might have seen a year or two later is because I never remembered a video store ever not letting me rent an R-rated film. And certainly by the time a movie appears on HBO or Showtime at that point, or Cinemax, all you had was a warning, and then you were just on the honor system. That's a really good topic. You just
there was also VHS,
which is that teenagers. Let me just sequence into this.
Well, I want to ask you a question about Fame, because I haven't seen it, but
okay.
The characters in Fame, were they kids like who grew up in the city, or were they mostly, or
they were
the burbs?
Kids who went to music and art in the city. They were New York City kids.
So it was a very urban movie.
Performing art, yeah.
Okay.
And while it did run as a TV show concurrently throughout the 80s while these things were going on. But it's an interesting point, which is that as a teenager myself in the 80s, I would see R-rated movies with my mom, and I'd see a lot of R-rated movies in the 70s too that were adult themed. But there is something about the way that sexuality, and all these different things that you're dealing with, crime, class, all these things in a very gritty way that really defined almost 70s filmmaking starts to really reappear in early 80s films. And the first film I really want to hit that I really think it's a very good film because it's Fast Times at Ridgemont High, which I think you've seen.
That's right.
And it was directed by Amy Heckerling. It was she would go on actually to do Clueless. She's a really solid director. But the screenplay was written by Cameron Crowe. And in, I think, 1979, when Cameron Crowe, if you've seen, what was the film he did, Almost Famous, he was 15 years old in San Diego when he started writing for the Rolling Stone. And then when he was 18, the Rolling Stone hired him to go undercover after he graduated high school to a Southern California high school and be a teen. And he wrote this memoir, which was called Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I think it came out in 80. It was about 1979. If you're a really big fan of this, feel free to correct me in the comments. But I read the book when it came out, and it was a great book. And there are some slight differences in that. I think instead of Pat Benatar, they reference the lead singer from Cheap Trick as the look that all the high school students wanted. But for the most part, Cameron Crowe must have just barely been 20-something when he wrote the screenplay for this. And I would argue it's the first film to come out about teenagers that is really on the eye level of what it's like to be a teen. It has some great actors, Phoebe Cates, Jennifer Jason Leigh. There's some male leads, Judd Reinhold, but for the most part, and Sean Penn. There's a number of stories because it was based on what was going on in the lives of these different high school students. Jennifer Jason, Phoebe Cates or Jennifer? Yes, I'm getting a little confused. Phoebe Cates plays an inherently good girl who gets caught up in a love triangle. Jennifer Jason Leigh plays a hot girl. These become very big archetypes. I remember that she has a brother named Brad, who is a nerdier guy, but not a very, she falls for these, there's the guy named Ricky the Rat, and there's his buddy, and she gets torn between a good guy and the bad guy, and then there's a great character of Spicoli, played by Sean Penn, who is the surfer, who is the dude, and is constant war with Mr. Hand.
Well, he's a marijuana addict, right? I mean, that's the
he's
central to his character.
And it's a very 70s thing brought into the 80s, that he's an unabashed stoner. And
which was very common. I mean, kids today might not understand this, but I've heard stories about the 70s where kids would just go to high school and be high all day long, every day.
And in the 80s as well. Yeah, that I don't think kids have.
That's not part of my experience at school, but I don't know if
I'm not going to talk about it, but I'm just saying that definitely from the 60s until yesterday, kids have been getting high in high school. But it's a good film. It's Fast Times at Ridgemont High is like almost like American Graffiti in that there's a whole bunch of different characters having a whole bunch of different stories. It's an ensemble film. Every 5 years I watch it again. I know some people who truly hate that film and find it too dark and too disturbing, but
what do they find disturbing about it?
I think it is. It's not it's a funny movie, but it really does have it as abortions. It's a hard film, and then a film that if you like Fast Times at Ridgemont High, you also probably saw Valley Girl, which starred Deborah Foreman. I have no idea what happened to her. Directed by Martha Coolidge, who would go on to do Rambling Rose and win an Academy Award. Really solid director who does TV today. And introducing a young guy named Nicolas Cage. I have no idea whatever happened to him. And the premise of Valley Girl is a weird movie because in that period of time, I think it was like 81, Moon Unit Zappa put out a song called Valley Girl, which is a very funny song about what it's like to be a teen in the San Fernando Valley. And I'm sure, much like Fast Times probably was greenlit to cash in on the success of Porky's. Valley Girl, the movie, was written in to cash in on the success of a song that became a big Valley Girl. The song became so popular that words like "for sure" and "Grody to the max" became popular buzzwords in high school. They had put it on T-shirts. They even had like books out on how to speak like a Valley Girl. It was
it coined the term Valley Girl, probably.
Right. And
could I just say a couple things?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I just want to say quickly, it's probably like the quintessential like teen comedy of this era. Like if you're gonna watch one of these movies, I mean, critics cite it constantly.
I think it's a seminal work, but there's other films on this list.
Well, yeah, I mean, just in terms of like quality, you mean? But okay,
well,
about Valley.
It's part of the. But you saw Valley Girl, right?
Yeah. So about Valley Girl, Valley Girl is really interesting because it's really concerned about the urban-suburban divide. That
There's
all these movies are like all these movies
from the privileged valley.
Right.
I don't remember where.
It's a romance. Valley Girl
falls in love with a guy from Hollywood.
Valley Girl's
a working class guy.
Valley Girl's a romance, and like all great romances, there has to be something that keeps the protagonists apart. And what is it that keeps them apart? Well, one guy is from the urban area, and the girl is from the suburban area. And you have to understand about Los Angeles. Okay, the reason this contrast is stark in Los Angeles because the valley that they call it in Los Angeles is actually protected from Hollywood and the rest of the urban area of Los Angeles by a literal mountain range. And there's some houses in the mountains, but yeah, there's literally a mountain range between the urban suburban divide in Los Angeles. So it's quite a stark contrast. And when you watch the movie, they highlight it. You know, there's a lot of great outside cinematography from that era. You can see what LA looked like both in the valley and in the city, especially Hollywood. It's a really good Hollywood photography there. You can really see Hollywood in that movie. But yeah, I mean, a lot of these movies, almost all these movies, like have that as an element. Wouldn't you say, Chris? I mean, some of them are. Yeah, some of them take place entirely in the suburbs, but.
Well, I think you're picking up this theme that becomes popular, which is the city is a place of sex and danger, and it's interesting. Well, we're pretty much segueing right into Risky Business, which takes place actually in the middle of America in the Tony suburbs of Chicago. I can't remember if it's Evanston or if it's. My friends from the Midwest, of course, are probably watching this, shouting exactly what town and what suburb of Chicago it takes place. I'm sorry, I'm an old man. I forget. But in it, Tom Cruise plays a high school senior in a very upscale suburb who he and his buddies are planning to get into good colleges. They're worried about what schools. He's a virgin. Again, we're going back to sex. And he ends up hiring out a call girl played by Rebecca De Mornay. I do believe that actually all the call girls and all of that, they're all from Chicago. They're all from the city.
He has to go to the city. He has to go from his Tony rich mostly white suburb to the city to get a call girl, right? I mean, that's where all the call girls are, right?
Well, they call him. He doesn't drive anywhere yet in the story. They show up late at night because his parents are away, and he's expecting to do an interview with Princeton, an alumni interview. Joel, that's his name.
Let me just say about
go ahead. Plot for those people who haven't watched it first, but definitely. And anyway, go ahead. Hilarity ensues.
I was just gonna say, if you think Rebecca De Mornay is attractive at all, this is your movie.
Oh, she's gorgeous in this movie. She is gorgeous.
There's some nudity from her. I mean, it's great. There's a sex.
Yeah, but no, that's true. I was just gonna say instead of dealing with LA from this point forward, really what we're dealing with is the city of Chicago. And the city of Chicago becomes the stand-in for every American city pretty much for the rest of the decade. So this is the beginning of the dichotomy of suburban life, upper middle class living, and the dangers of adulthood and what lurks in the city as some sort of delicious fun. It's written by Paul Schrader, who won the Academy Award for writing Taxi Driver. I think as a script, it's one of the tightest scripts ever. Joe Pantoliano plays the antagonist, Guido the Killer Pimp. It's, I think, the first time I ever saw Joe Pantoliano in a film. It's definitely the first time I saw Tom Cruise in a film. I know he was in Taps, but I don't remember him in Taps. And I think it's also directed by Paul Schrader. I might be wrong, but it's a solid film because every scene just pushes it forward. I can't remember the name of the actor who plays his best friend in it, but he'd go on to do Moonlighting. Very funny guy. There's a lot of great lines. But yeah, part of it really does it really hits what it's like to be a kid from privilege. You know, what it's like to have the expectations to do as well as your parents. All his parents want him to do is to get into Princeton. And, you know, Joe, I think we're going to have spoilers on this. So hopefully you've seen the movie. If you haven't, then here comes a big plot point, which is that he learns how to make money running a brothel. And
very dark.
That's a very 80s motif. Even in the grown-up comedies, one of the things that you see a lot of, especially moving into the mid 80s, is comedies about weird ways to make a lot of money. Because I think as we're getting away from the 70s, where money making is somehow bad, and the hippie lifestyle is better, one of the things that you really start seeing in 80s films is all the perverse ways one can become wealthy.
There's definitely a complete abandonment of any kind of hippie ideology, I feel, except for maybe free drug use and sex.
Right. So Joel's manipulation of all these other trust fund kids to help pay off for it's his dad's Porsche that gets ruined. Another motif that will become very popular in 80s movies is ruining your dad's Porsche or his luxury car. I'm sure there's a Freudian reason behind that.
Well, outside of New York, the car you drive is like a major status symbol. It's very important, right? So
yeah, and it is weird because I did see that movie, and Risky Business is a really, I mean, Fast Times and Valley Girl they're good movies, but L.A., I guess, at this point was a fantasy place. Chicago was too, but I saw Risky Business the summer before I started my senior year of high school. So Joel and I are roughly the same age, and I'm watching this movie worrying about what college I'm going to get into. Certainly I didn't get into Princeton. Actually, I ended up going to college in the Midwest, not too far from where Risky Business takes place in Wisconsin, as opposed to Chicago. But it is absolutely where my mind was at watching that movie, where I was in my relationships with girls, where I was in my own level of maturity, where I was in my need to be a good, I came from a nice upper middle class family. My dad had gone to an Ivy League college. So on some level, and Joel was a real high achiever, on some level, I could totally key into Joel. And I really felt like Tom, especially his Wayfarers. I went out and bought a pair of black Wayfarers just like him. I got the Tom Cruise haircut just like him. It was the beginning of what will one day be another episode called My Long Adoration of Tom Cruise as a spokesman for men of my generation. And that was certainly for many of us our introductions to Tom Cruise. He's not a nerd per se. He's not a wise ass per se. He's really not playing any particular archetype. He's just, in that film, he's just a really average kid who's got extraordinary pressures, who's just trying to work his way through it. It's such a grounded performance.
It's all about his anxiety of going to college, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
and it's so keyed in. I mean, I remember watching that movie, laughing and also clutching my fists at the same time. And of course, there is obviously the way that you look at women when you're a teen boy and a woman versus a girl. It's certainly one of my favorite films from that decade, and it resonates with me on a lot of levels. A film I do want to mention before we get out of this particular thing that you may not have seen that also kind of deals with sexuality in the suburbs is a movie called The Last American Virgin. And I honestly don't remember where in the world it takes place outside of the United States in the suburban area, but that's a much darker version of all of the films that we've just talked about. It's about a nerdy kid and his buddies. With the exception, I think, of Steve Anton, no one in this film ever had a career after this film, not even the director. And he falls for a popular girl, and at first she's not into him, and then she gets pregnant by her boyfriend, and then her boyfriend dumps her, and then they go out together, he loses her virginity to her. I'm totally giving away too much. And it's not a fantasy film. Unlike Risky Business, which is completely a fantasy, and unlike, say, Valley Girl, which is a very happy movie in its way, and Ridgemont High, which is a happy movie, no, it's a comedy, and it's barely a comedy, but the way, the emotional through line and the way it depicts what it's like to be a high schooler, and the way it even depicts success and failure, it definitely spoke to me as a high school schooler as the most honest story of being a teen as a teen. I really like that film. If you have the opportunity to find it somewhere, I don't know where. I remember when it came out, George Will wrote in Newsweek how teen movies were just like the devils and how bad society had become.
I'm going to look that up.
He had not seen the movie Last American Virgin. And I
heard about it.
He just thought the title was so profane that in and of itself, I think he would have maybe even liked the film because it's a cautionary tale, but so dark.
Well, it's hilarious how so many movies they seem to present themselves as having a strong point of view, and then when you watch the movie, they move to the middle, and you see that even today, ideologically speaking.
When I say it's a cautionary tale, I don't mean that it's a mainstream film. I just means that it's not Porky's. It's not a lighthearted comedy.
Well, it's a low-budget movie, right? It's not a major release, right? I mean,
and all of these films that we've mentioned up to this point are low-budget movies because in the early 80s, people were not investing a lot of money in comedies for teens.